The Gestapo called her the White Mouse. They plastered her face across wanted posters from Paris to Marseille. They tapped phones, surveilled safe houses, and interrogated everyone she had ever spoken to. At one point, they put a 5 million franc bounty on her head, the highest price they had ever offered for a single person in occupied France. They never caught her. Not once. This is the story of Nancy Wake, the woman who ran escape routes for Allied soldiers, blew up German infrastructure, led resistance fighters into battle, and became the most decorated Allied servicewoman of the Second World War. Stay until the end. Because the final chapter of her life is the one that explains everything that came before it. Nancy Wake was born in New Zealand in 1912 and raised in Australia, the youngest of 6 children in a family that gave her very little reason to stay. Her father left when she was young and never came back. Her mother was cold and distant in ways that Nancy never quite forgave. At 14, she ran away from home with a small inheritance from an aunt and did not look back. By her early 20s, she had worked her way across Australia, through New York, and eventually to London and then Paris, where she landed a job as a journalist and discovered the thing that would define the rest of her life, a talent for being exactly where history was happening. In 1934, covering stories across Europe as a correspondent, Nancy Wake witnessed Nazi rallies in Vienna. She watched men in uniforms beat Jewish people in the streets while crowds looked on. She was 22 years old, and she made a decision in that moment that she would later describe as simple. She decided that if war came, she would fight. Not write about it, fight. War came in September 1939. By then, Nancy was living in Marseille with her French industrialist husband, Henry Fiocca, wealthy, well-connected, and positioned in exactly the right city at exactly the right moment. When France fell to Germany in June 1940 and the Vichy regime began its collaboration with the Nazis, Nancy did not retreat into the safety her husband's money and social standing could have offered her. She went to work. She began by helping individual Allied soldiers, British troops stranded after Dunkirk. Airmen shot down over France, moved through the country and across the border into Spain. She used her social connections, her fluent French, and her complete comfort in occupied social settings to move through checkpoints and past German officers who never suspected that the elegant, confident Frenchwoman at the dinner party was running an escape network out of her handbag. She recruited couriers, established safe houses, forged documents, and built relationships with people across southern France who were willing to risk everything to resist. The Gestapo noticed. They began calling her the White Mouse because she kept slipping through their traps. Phone lines she used went silent before they could be traced. Safe houses she had visited were empty by the time raids came. Informants trying to locate her kept losing the thread. She was not lucky. She was disciplined, observant, and faster than the machinery trying to catch her. By 1942, the pressure had become too great to stay. The network she had built was being dismantled, and the Gestapo's pursuit of her had intensified to the point that remaining in France meant capture. Nancy left Henry behind and attempted to cross the Pyrenees into Spain on foot. The first attempt failed. She was arrested, held, and interrogated for several weeks before managing to escape. She crossed the mountains on the second attempt. She reached Madrid. She eventually made it to London. She was 30 years old. She had already done more than most people manage in a lifetime. She was just getting started. In London, Nancy Wake was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, Britain's covert sabotage and resistance organization, established on Churchill's direct order to set occupied Europe ablaze. The SOE trained Nancy in weapons, explosives, hand-to-hand combat, radio operation, and parachute insertion. She was methodical in training, physically tough, and completely without the anxiety that broke other recruits. In April 1944, weeks before D-Day, she parachuted back into occupied France in the dark, landing in the Auvergne region to link up with the resistance network of several thousand Maquis fighters operating in the mountains. What she found was a resistance movement with courage and numbers but serious problems. The Maquis fighters were poorly coordinated, undersupplied, and operating on radio equipment that had been compromised. Within days of her arrival, the radio codes for the entire network were lost. Communication with London and with it the supply drops of weapons, money, and medicine the resistance depended on went dark. Nancy Wake got on a bicycle and rode 500 kilometers through German-occupied France to retrieve new codes from a contact in another region. It took her 72 hours. She rode through checkpoints, past German patrols, and across terrain that had no margin for error. She came back with the codes. The supply drops resumed. The months between her insertion and the liberation of France in the summer of 1944 were among the most intense of the entire war for the French interior. Nancy coordinated weapons drops, led raids, and participated directly in combat operations. In one engagement, she killed an SS guard with her bare hands to prevent him from raising an alarm during a raid. She described it later the way she described everything, without decoration, without apology, without any apparent need for the listener to be impressed. She was made a leader within the Maquis structure in a context where women were not supposed to lead anything, commanding men who had initially resisted her authority and eventually followed her without question because she was, by any measure, the most competent person in the room. By the time the liberation came, the network she had helped rebuild and supply had played a documented role in tying down German forces in the Auvergne, forces that could otherwise have been redirected to resist the Allied landings in Normandy. The strategic contribution of the French resistance to D-Day is debated by historians in its precise dimensions, but Nancy Wake's contribution to the resistance is not. After the war, she went looking for Henry. She found out that the Gestapo had arrested him after she escaped to Spain. They had interrogated him about her network and her location. He had told them nothing. He had died in their custody in 1943. Nancy Wake received that information and carried it for the rest of her life in the particular way that people carry things they cannot put down and do not speak about. She received the George Medal from Britain, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, the Médaille de la Resistance from France, and the Companion of the Order of Australia. She was, by the end of the accounting, the most decorated Allied servicewoman of the Second World War. She was also largely unknown to the general public for most of her post-war life, and she preferred it that way. She moved to London in her later years, spent time in a hotel bar she considered her living room, and gave interviews occasionally with the air of someone doing a minor administrative task. She died in 2011 at the age of 98. If that story deserved more than the footnote history gave it, subscribe. And please do share this with someone who thinks they know the story of World War II. This might surprise them.